Last little part of chapter 30, looking at the end of the 60s. We left off with the escalation of the Vietnam War and how that had caused a lot of years of turmoil at home, a lot of that coming with student revolts. 1964, there's a student protest movement launched at Berkeley where a small group of students resisted the university efforts to try to keep them, deny them a place to solicit volunteers and funds for off-campus causes, basically wanting to end the university's restrictions on student political activity. So they launched a free speech movement, led to a lot of riots. A lot of it came from challenging the older generation's materialism. This whole thing fueled by free speech movements, very suspicious of the generation who viewed affluence as an answer to their problems, not really understanding the years of sacrifice that generation had gone through with depression, the war, restrictions, and sacrifices that had happened during World War II. Higher education, they saw that as a servant of corporate culture, formed the Students for Democratic Society, a radical organization that wanted to rid American society of poverty, racism, violence, and preferred individual action to bureaucracy. Vietnam War was definitely a big target for them, and there was this widespread cultural uprising, the experimentation with drugs, rock and roll music. Older generations thought that traditional values, Puritan work ethic, all of that, and family values were under attack. Protesting the Vietnam War in October 1967, 100,000 protesters protested at the Pentagon. It was male students, housewives, teachers, young professionals. One of the common chants that you could hear at this protest would be, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today?" Very anti-Vietnam War and very anti the government's response and policy on the Vietnam War. Demonstrations were suppressed usually by a combination of force with the police who would regain control. Others, it was a compromise, concessions that were made, letting the young students have a voice in university curriculum meetings. A lot of causes. Teach-ins were a big thing with some of the universities. Protests grew louder, more radical. There was a cultural revolution that went on. Sexual expression became much more of a prominent public issue now that birth control pills began in 1960, so increased sexual activity, but also increased sexual abuse and rape cases and crime as well. Clothing, blue jeans, the love beads, long hair, unkept beards, bare feet, all of that was very common dress. A lot of new drug experimentation. LSD became a popular drug of choice. A lot of young people experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs. Music was a big change, and a lot of lyrics from music reflected the things that were going on in the time period. Common names that you might recognize: Beatles, Rolling Stones, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, Beatles, Joan Baez, all of those that were, whether it was just the time period or reflection of some of the current events that were going on. Woodstock, in terms of music, it was about 400,000 young people. It was a 3-day festival of rock and roll, along with a lot of the other new expressions that were popular during the time period. Some extremism kind of provoked outrage. Others challenged the hypocrisy they saw in society. The Black Power movement began mid-1960s. Began with riots in the cities. Things went from petty criminal activities to more of a violent protest, burning of buildings, looting stores. Some people died in the riots. You have the rise of militant leaders that would promote black separatism and armed struggle. Malcolm X was the new name of Elijah Muhammad, who was the Black Muslim leader. Preached black nationalism, separatism, self-improvement, advocated self-defense, using black violence against white violence. Martin Luther King tried to lead an anti-poverty crusade. He was against the war and saw poverty as a good enemy to attack. Before he could actually lead that, he was assassinated in Memphis. He had been a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and in response to his death, riots broke out in over 125 cities, leaving about 46 dead from all the revolts. We have different groups that were formed. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is still around, repudiates the whole nonviolence. IDEA adopts more of the Black Power movement. Black Panthers were organized, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, people trying to get people take pride in their African roots. You see more of the Afro hairstyles, more ethnic styles of dress and clothing, pushing for Black study programs, beginning to really push the ethnic nationalism idea. Other groups wanted to emulate that idea. Native Americans were against school mascots like Stanford, enact other ethnic studies programs. Cesar Chavez organized national farm workers, mobilizing the grape pickers and lettuce workers in California, trying to appeal to the ethnic nationalism of Mexican Americans, led to an increase of hourly wages, and also Chicanos working for mandating bilingual education. For women's liberation, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique. It called the American home a comfortable concentration camp and encouraged women to seek fulfillment in professional careers. She said there were definite gender roles as seen on TV and tried to get housewives to see they had no self-esteem or self-identity, and so they needed to go and seek fulfillment in professional careers in order to gain that sense of identity. She also helped organize NOW, National Organization for Women, which adopted more activist tactics. More feminist activism. The Civil Rights Act was used to attack inequality in employment. Filed for equal wages, daycare for children, pro-choice advocacy on abortion, and tougher laws on rape laws were also part of their agenda. And also the Equal Rights Amendment that they had sent to the state was defeated in the 70s because of conservative reaction to radical feminists. Wanted equal rights for women, for gender equality. Politics at the end of the era, 1968. Nixon is going to make a comeback in the presidential election. LBJ is going to withdraw from taking on another term. Massive protests. We talked about the race riots. Richard Nixon is going to demonstrate desire for national reconciliation and pull a lot of the conservative middle class vote. Vietnam had really hurt Lyndon B. Johnson's ability to gain more political approval. Tet Offensive, which people watched and realized that this war would not be won, at least not anytime soon, and so needed to conclude it quickly. Johnson will begin to try to wrap up with peace talks in Vietnam and announce that he would not return for a second term. Democrats going into the 1968 election, the ticket was divided. Robert Kennedy was the more traditional Democratic vote, had the blue-collar vote, the minorities, and after during the campaigning, after he won the California primary, he was assassinated by an Arab nationalist. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the National Convention, broke out into huge anti-war protests. Police were out in mass. Everyone saw us on TV, and so they really associate. The protests at the convention really hurt their public opinion. People associated the Democrats with violence and anti-war protests, and so that's going to hurt them in the election. So the Republicans unite behind Richard Nixon. Wallace is going to be the third-party vote. Nixon is going to win by a very narrow victory. He will get 43% of the popular vote, and the consequence of this is it ends a 30-year era of liberal reform. A lot of the reforms from the New Frontier, Great Society, both JFK and LBJ's programs were very similar to things that have been in motion since FDR and the New Deal. So it's going to end that era of liberal reform and people looking for a less intrusive government overall. Okay, moving on to Chapter 31, picking up with Nixon, where we left off. Just as a side note on this picture, Nixon had actually been involved in various aspects of the government for a while. One of the things he was involved in was he was part of HUAC, House of Un-American Activities Committee, as part of the Alger Hiss trial, all of the second Red Scare that was happening, McCarthyism, was very involved. All right, in his first term, he was very successful. He was the new Nixon, appeared in 1969. He was a man of restraint. His policy towards foreign affairs was détente, very skillful in reducing Cold War tension. Nixon had cut himself off, however, from Congress, his cabinet, the nation. His administration focuses on isolating him from these different aspects, and he relies very heavily on one advisor, his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. He does have a very strong staff, but he really distrusts everybody. He was very paranoid of his administration, of his cabinet, and so he really isolates himself from everybody. The old Nixon was just below the surface, very shy, distrustful, wants to run the show without the input of others. Nixon was very efficient in his administration. He promises to bring America together. In his inaugural speech, he focused on making the federal bureaucracy function differently. He shifts a lot of the responsibility to the states. New federalism, for him, gave $30 billion in grants for social problems, programs, shifts responsibility from D.C. to the state and local governments, giving the federal funds to help with local needs. He will shift school desegregation to the courts. 1969, Justice Department wanted to delay desegregation process in schools. Supreme Court denies this. Supreme Court ruled the termination of dual schools should be done at once, and this way Supreme Court was hated rather than Nixon by the Southern white voters. There's also a shift to a more conservative Supreme Court. The appointment of conservatives. Warren Burger had very moderate views, very conservative views. He's going to replace Earl Warren, who was retiring, as the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And this very conservative Supreme Court does not overturn any major Warren Court decisions. A lot of the ones that we've been studying over the past few chapters holds up the legality of things like desegregation. Pace of change is going to slow down, but it's not going to really change. Not ready to abandon any of the reforms that were adopted in the 1960s. Still committed to those. They will reform things like the welfare system, however. Nixonomics. Nixon was facing inflation that had occurred from Vietnam. The expensive fighting had led to a deficit and the cost of living was going up. So his plan was to cut federal spending, reduce the government spending. Interest rates were going to be forced up. He wants the Federal Reserve Board to raise interest rates to slow down the expansion of business. He is going to induce a recession. Inflation was going to continue and unemployment was going up. Some companies were going under. And so he induces a recession, puts on a 90-day wage control, 90-day freeze on wages and prices so that could give some of the time to some of those problems to work themselves out, to iron themselves out. So the economy does start to revive. They have a surtax on imports to help the industrial production, increases the economy within about 5% in the first quarter of 1972. All right, for political party distribution, he's obsessed about his reelection, obsessed with the fact that he only got 43% of the popular vote in the last election. Republicans at this point are the minority party. Congress election, the midterm election in 1970 lost seats to the Democrats, and he wants to win over the white Southern voters and the blue-collar workers. And so he becomes very inactive in the desegregation in order to win over the South. He attacks the Cultural Revolution to win over Middle America, Southern whites, Catholic ethnic groups, blue-collar workers, new suburbanites in the South and West. Really appeals to those groups through attacking the Cultural Revolution or the counterculture revolution that everyone saw as threatening the traditional ways of American life. The silent majority, those conservatives against counterculture, demanding law and order, and so he's really going to go along with those. Democrats will retain majority by joining the crusade against drugs and crime, but prove that economics can also be more crucial at this point. So that's where he's going to, that and foreign policy is going to be where he focuses his attention. In his foreign policy, he is going to rely very heavily on Henry Kissinger, who was a former refugee from Nazi Germany, to form his foreign policy. And one of the things that changes is they see the Cold War as something to be managed, not won. It's seen as an ideological struggle for survival of communism. Now it's a great power rivalry, and so realizing we just need to manage the relationship between these major powers to make a strategic retreat from trying to take over and change and change their minds on how they run things. And so we're going to try to achieve something called détente, or relaxation of tension with the Soviet Union. Both want to withdraw from the arms race, and both have a mutual desire to reduce tension. We're going to use American trade. We're going to improve our relationship with China. Soviets view China as a dangerous adversary, so if we improve our relationship with China, that will help us to improve our relationship with Russia as well. And so we increase our correspondence with them, Nixon actually visits China in 1972, meets with communist leaders, and ends 2 decades of hostility.